Welcome back to Imagine If. I'm your host as always, The Butler. If you're new to the channel, welcome. This series is called Real versus Fake Scary Stories. I will be telling you a short paranormal or scary story. You, the viewer, decide if the story is based on actual facts and deemed as true, or you can go with the determination of it being completely false and made up from my creative imagination. At the end of the show, I will tell you if this story was true or completely false. Enjoy the show, and remember to like and subscribe to the channel if you are enjoying my content. Are you ready to play? The Barber Shop. The story that I'm about to tell you happened to me last year. My name is Marshall. I've been going to the same barbershop now for about 10 years or so. Over the last decade, I've only had two barbers. The first was a high school friend of mine who used to cut hair in high school before renting a booth from a local shop. His name was Bobby. He got married and moved to Mexico 6 years ago. Since then, I've been getting my hair cut by Charles, but we all call him Chucky. I usually only have time to get my hair cut after work, so roughly about 6 or 7 o'clock-ish. Regardless of the time, I religiously get my hair cut every Thursday night. The shop usually has 4 other barbers working along Chucky. So, I was waiting to get my hair cut, and a man walked into the barbershop, and he sat quietly in the corner. He was an older gentleman and seemed pretty quite standoffish. He was wearing clothing that did not fit modern day attire. He literally looked like he was from a different era, but I did not pay that much attention. I actually thought it looked pretty cool and kind of wanted to cop his style myself. When it was my turn to go and get my hair cut, the man stood up and looked at me as if I did something wrong. I walked slowly towards the barber's chair, and as I was approaching the chair, he cut me off and just stared at me. I asked him, "Is everything okay?" He put his hand on my shoulder and told me that everything was going to be okay. I didn't think much of it besides this guy's probably some type of lunatic. I've never seen him before. I just kind of chuckled and played it off. I asked him again, "What do you mean?" He said, "Nothing." And he just smiled at me and walked away. He left the barbershop, and as he left a white box on the chair he was sitting in. I called for him to let him know that he left his box and actually chased him outside, but once we got outside, he was nowhere to be found. Me and Chucky were just confused, to say the least. There was a note attached to the box that said, "Open me tonight at 11 p.m. And on the bottom of the box, it had my initials. I took the box and decided that I would open the box as instructed. When I arrived back home, I noticed that my front door was wide open and there were no lights on in the house. First thought came to my mind was someone had broken into my house. There were no broken glass anywhere that I could see, but the doors were off the hinges as if someone just kicked them in. I walked around the house and did not find a thing. I didn't find a trace of anything. In fact, nothing was missing at all. I guess it's a good thing that nothing was missing, but my peace of mind was just not there. I called the police and they showed up about 20 minutes later. Unfortunately, all they can do is take my statement. Almost immediately after they left, I remembered that box that I got from the old guy at the barbershop. I opened the box and there was a phone number attached to it. I called the phone number and a kid picked up the phone. The voice sounded like a 10-year-old girl or boy, something close to that age range. The kid on the phone seemed to be distracted with whatever else was going on the other side of the phone. The kid would say hello and then kind of giggle away off into the distance. After a few seconds, the kid became more focused, and clear as day, he said the words, "George James. George James. George James." The kid just kept repeating George James. I asked him, "Who is George James?" The kid never answered me. He just kept chanting George James. This went on for about 5-7 minutes or so, and then the phone disconnected. I went to sleep, and the next day I went to the library and I looked up George James of my town. There were a couple people named George James according to Facebook, but nothing stood out. Then I came across George James of my town, and this guy was arrested in 1953 for murder. I was strolling down, and I got a lot of info on this guy, and then his photo showed up. It was a mugshot, and I couldn't believe my eyes. George James was the same exact guy that I met at the barbershop who left me the box. He's the same guy who left the box with the phone number in it for me to call, which is just kind of impossible. I kept on researching a lot of repetitive information, and then things took a turn for the sinister worse. George James had lived in my house that I'm currently living in for 18 years. He had a 7-year-old daughter that went missing and gave the entire town a big uproar. According to police records, police found traces of blood in George's house that did not belong to George himself. Although George claimed that he was 100% innocent, George James was arrested. After being found guilty by a jury, George spent the remainder of his life in prison before dying in 1996. As I was driving back home from the library, I tried to call the number again. The phone rang well over 20 times. This time, the kid picked up the phone, and this kid was a lot more attentive. I asked the kid, "What's your name?" And she said, "Elizabeth." She told me that her dad's name was George James, and that he killed her when she was 7 years old. She told me that there were videotapes buried in the backyards underneath the fountain. The videotape showed George beating his tied up daughter literally to death with his bare hands. I asked her, "Where are you?" She just laughed. She said that she was in a happy place. I went into the backyard while still on the phone with her and dug up the tapes. I called the police immediately. Once the police arrived, they watched the tapes on my VCR. With these tapes that I just dug up, the case was finally closed. I tried to call the phone number back and also gave the phone number to the police. And every time we called, the number says this number has been disconnected. Now that I think about it, I'm even more afraid. How in the hell did George James deliver me this box? And if it was hypothetically George's twin, he would have aged tremendously. What's even more creepier than that is the spooky little girl, Elizabeth, that I had a full-blown conversation with. Is her spirit just trapped somewhere in purgatory? I don't know what to think anymore. 100% of my heart tells me that we are currently living in the Matrix. Now it's time to find out if this story was true or false. How do you guys think you did tonight? If you thought that this story was true, I gotcha. This story is completely false and made up from my creative imagination. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys on the next episode of Real versus Fake Scary Stories.